My name is Jerm. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas.
I encourage everybody to give me a phone call if you ultimately want to talk about this, because what I'm going to say in this next hour is probably going to be in opposition to the vast majority of what most people believe. My phone number is 310-619-3055. I live in California. Text me, Telegram, WhatsApp, Signal, however you want to get a hold of me. If you want to have a respectful conversation about this topic, I welcome the opportunity. The core information, and really you should know that projectinhumanity.com is a drop in the bucket of what's coming. I've got an enormous amount of research that I'm going to be passing along. So anybody who's watching this can go to Project in Humanity. There's a little double entendre there, if you get it. .com, projectinhumanity.com. I'm not going to tease it to the end. I'm sorry, I can't do that. I'm going to dive right in and just be bold and blunt, okay? If people listening to this have ever looked up in the sky and they see white lines behind airplanes, if they see those white lines spreading out into, what ultimately becomes a hazy cloud cover, that is not something being sprayed on you. That is not airplanes with tanks of, nanoparticulate matter coming through pumps and pipes and hoses and spray jets and all that kind of thing. But what you see is barely 5% of the problem, because 95% of what you could call, I will not use the term chemtrail, I will not use the term contrail. There are trails of chemicals that are spewing out of every airplane, every helicopter, every jet aircraft, and here's the part that people need to pay attention to, every rocket, every missile, and every piece of space junk, satellites and garbage up in space that is re-entering into the atmosphere. It's basically pollution. And there is, in my mind, a probably not coordinated in the physical world, maybe in the mental space, but there is a false flag that is being perpetrated upon the population to get people to look at a mysterious, oh, they're spraying us concept, when the reality is all of that can be very easily explained in very simple and straightforward ways. And that's what I've done on projectinhumanity.com. Now,
yeah, I just want to make sure that I'm following you before we go any further. So what you're saying is it's an accidental kind of geoengineering, right? Where you have sort of massive environmental damage that's been caused by routine aviation and, of course, rocket operations. And this is not about secret spraying programs or even deliberate spraying programs. It's about legal pollution. Is that right?
With a tiny, tiny, tiny little caveat, okay? I am absolutely not denying that the possibility of, covert, nefarious, certainly the government has sprayed crap on the population in the past, and there is every possibility, that things like that are happening. But in general, what you said, yes, I'm just going to say it again. There are approximately 100,000 flights a day in commercial aviation. Times 365 days, it's millions of flights. There is approximately 100 billion gallons of jet fuel that is combusted in those, aluminum cylinders in the sky. When you look up in the sky and you see a white trail that then, fans out or whatever. You got to let go of the propaganda terminology of contrail versus chemtrail.
It's a false dichotomy.
Absolutely. You know the whole deal. There's a narrative and there's a false narrative. They're both the accepted narrative, and they hide the truth. So the lie, when people say there is a contrail, oh, it's just water vapor. No, it's not just water vapor. If you could imagine, see, people don't get a chance to do this. If you could imagine an Airbus, A380 and the engine that's behind it, you can't get anywhere near that, because if you got sucked into it, or you got, it'll blow, cars and trucks behind it, off their standing, and just, destroy anything behind it. The power behind these engines and the amount of air and fuel that they push out is absolutely astonishing. They burn easily a gallon of jet fuel every second. And so when people talk about a contrail, now it's usually the government, okay, saying, oh, these are not nefarious spraying things. That's just water vapor. Well, that's just water vapor, my butt. That's water vapor that is mixed with enormous amounts of combusted jet fuel. And so the use of the term contrail, if I ever hear anybody say the word contrail, I know immediately to go, hey, wait a minute, you're using language that is propaganda, okay? When somebody says, oh, look up in the sky, they're spraying chemtrails on us, that's a different kind of propaganda. Yes, it is a trail of chemicals, but it's not being sprayed, it's being spewed out of that jet engine. But here's the thing that when this wakes you up and you get this, it's astonishing. Now, the reason why sometimes you see those white lines in the sky and sometimes you don't is atmospheric. In the upper atmosphere, or I should say the upper troposphere, there are layers of air. Some of it is colder, some of it is more humid, and the best statistics I can find are about 5% of the miles flown by all aviation go through these cold, relatively moist areas called ice supersaturated regions. And when a jet aircraft flies through a limited area of the atmosphere and spews out all of the combustible materials from the jet fuel, Mother Nature does us a favor and causes ice crystals to condense on the particulate matter that is coming out of the jet engine, and you see the ice reflecting the sunlight. 95% of the time, the plane flies through the sky and you don't see the pollution coming out behind the engine. And so when you look up and there's a blue sky day, that is not a no spray day. The pollution is coming out of that jet engine just the same as it did on a day when it flew through different atmospheric conditions and you got the opportunity to see it. And so that's only one piece of the puzzle. If I can, unless you have another question, I'm going to rewind my life about a dozen years and share the Eureka moment that I had quite some time ago.
So you've got huge amounts of pollution occurring in the skies.
Unbelievable amounts.
And it's not just water vapor, as the official government argument might be, and it's not deliberately designed to kill everybody underneath it. Can I just read some of the data points that you've mentioned here? So you say 350 septillion pieces. Now, I can't wrap my head around what that number even means, but 350 septillion pieces of particulate matter.
Let's linger on that one. I know there's a big list. Okay, let's go down through the list. And when we get to the point on the list where I was going to tell the story that I was about to tell, I'll tell it then. Here in the United States, we're aware we're pushing $40 trillion in our national debt, and people can't wrap their head around that. If you go up from there, after trillion comes quadrillion, then quintillion, then sextillion, then septillion, okay? It's incomprehensible. A septillion is a trillion, okay? Now, to put it into context, now I didn't make that number up, 350 septillion, so you could say 350 trillion, right? You still can't comprehend it. It's an incomprehensible number. It's in the same order of magnitude as the estimated number of stars in the known universe, okay? And so what that number is, it came from a study from a couple of years ago where they were, with laser technology, they put an Airbus engine, in a laboratory, and I don't know how they do this, but they claim that they counted the number of microparticles that were coming out of the engine. And they determined that there was 100 quadrillion particles per second. Okay? Imagine an enormous engine, a gallon of jet fuel every second being vaporized and atomized. Well, a lot of it doesn't burn. And what you end up with are carbon particles that come out. That is the biggest weather modification, cloud seeding operation you could ever possibly imagine in your life. Flying through the air, millions of miles, millions of flights, billions of gallons of jet fuel being turned into cloud seeds. Okay? 350 septillion. It's an incomprehensible number. And I'll let you go down the list with whatever you're looking at there.
27.2 million pounds of carbon-based graphene-like particles.
They've studied the exhaust that is coming from the combustion. If you've ever had to take your automobile for a smog test, okay, they hook it up to a pipe and they see what's coming out. And, if you're polluting, they tell you go get your car tuned up or whatever. Well, they've done that with jet engines. And what they've identified is that after the combustion happens in the jet engine, if you go about 15 meters down the trail behind the engine, chemistry is still happening in what is kind of almost, you can think of it as a plasma, right? That hot, gas coming out of the jet engine continues to have chemical reactions happening. And 15 meters out of the exhaust, they have identified that the soot particles start to coagulate together into onion-shaped graphene. Now, people talk about graphene, they talk about graphene oxide, they talk about graphene nanoparticles and all that sort of stuff. If you get into the chemistry, and I'm going to maybe jump down the list a little bit, have you, this is going to sound like I'm going off on a tangent, but go with me here. Have you ever come across, used, or known anybody who used mothballs?
For what?
People put mothballs in their expensive wool clothing, because it's a neurotoxin. It kills moths. It kills their larvae. If you have a moth...
Hang on, James. Only my grandparents ever used mothballs.
Okay. If you have a wool suit or, clothing, coat or something, and a moth lands on it and drops its eggs, the larva will eat the wool, okay? And so many people will pack their, relatively expensive clothing in mothballs. I think it's horrible and disgusting and dangerous and nasty, but, that's a thing. Well, mothballs are a neurotoxin, okay? they're made from a compound called naphthalene. Naphthalene has got basically two benzene rings stuck together, and it's horribly toxic. Okay, you've got the white mothballs that people put in with their clothing. Well, where does that come from? It's naturally occurring in petroleum, and on international standards, up to 3% of jet fuel can be naphthalene. It's nasty. Now, typically, it's about 2%. So naphthalene doesn't actually do a good job of combusting and producing energy. It actually kind of just goes through the thing and ends up as waste material. It's one of the main ingredients of the invisible microparticles that come out of the engine. But anybody who knows the chemistry, you take a bunch of carbon rings and you start putting them all together, you get sheets of graphene. And so what they've found out is that naphthalene and other aromatics come out of the engine and form these onion-shaped graphene particles that have toxic metals in the middle of them. They might get coated with sulfur, and they become spectacular ice nucleation particles. The water vapor that comes out of the exhaust as well is attracted to that, immediately freezes. If you've ever seen somebody, in a very, very cold day, they get a pot of hot water and, they throw it up in the sky, and before it hits the ground, it turns into a cloud, it freezes. What you're looking at when you look up in the sky and you see a plane going across the sky and you go, oh, they're spraying us with the chemtrails today. It is a trail of chemicals, but it is the burnt residue of the jet fuel that has water vapor freezing on it in an area of the atmosphere that's really cold and really moist. And so it's conducive to, Mother Nature helps you see the pollution. If the aircraft keeps flying into a region that's a little bit warmer, a little bit less humid, the pollution is still there, but 95% of the time it's invisible. So on a blue sky day, there is just as much pollution up there. And so one of the things that I learned a dozen years ago, this isn't the one I was referring to, but it's another one. If you could imagine back in the 60s or the 70s when pollution was really horrible, and you could see an airplane take off and there'd just be a cloud of black soot behind it, like maybe you see with previously with diesel trucks and things like that. Well, they passed regulations to make it so that they limited the pollution coming out of the jet aircraft only to the point where it needs to be invisible. And so the particulate matter now is not big pieces of soot, right? Not big pieces of unburnt petroleum, but microscopic pieces that you can't see, which are actually more dangerous. And so 95% of the pollution being spewed by aviation across the sky is invisible. You only get to see the 5% that happens to attract some water vapor and reflects the sunlight.
Am I correct in saying that they did the same with car fumes? I mean, cars essentially...
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Okay.
With cars and very specifically trucks, they required with diesel that it now is ultra low sulfur diesel. And so they did not make that requirement with jet aircraft. So jet aircraft still has, it varies, 400 to 800 parts per million of sulfur, okay? You can't really put a catalytic converter on a jet aircraft, okay? It burns in a different way. And so, yes, cars and trucks, still do pollute the world in an enormous way. They just don't do it in the upper troposphere and the lower stratosphere, and it has a different impact.
2.15 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide. I mean, carbon dioxide has been an ongoing topic for years. We know that it actually doesn't create global warming, so it's almost it's almost irrelevant.
Here's the bigger issue with all of that. carbon dioxide is plant food, and anybody talking about global warming and all that, that's another conversation, not going to go there. Here's the bigger mind blower, okay? I'll ask you a rhetorical question. I won't put you on the spot and have you answer it, but what would be the normal thing that a person would think if you said, okay, if I had a pound of jet fuel or a kilogram of jet fuel, but let's go with a pound, right? If you had a pound of jet fuel, how much exhaust would you see come out of the engine that burned the pound of jet fuel? Well, it's not a pound. It's actually about 4.4 pounds of exhaust. The answer is very simple. In order to combust that hydrocarbon, you have to suck 3.4 times the weight in oxygen out of the atmosphere so that you get the oxygen to combine with the carbon. You get carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide, neither of which are necessarily good, but the point is combustion takes whatever is in the fuel, the hydrocarbon, and combines it with an enormous amount of oxygen. For decades, I've wondered why everybody focuses about, the tiny little level of carbon dioxide that, the atmosphere is increasing due to human activity. We're sucking that much oxygen out of the air to combine with the carbon. When you combine it with hydrogen in the hydrocarbon, you get H2O, you get water, right? So it's mind-boggling, but if you combust a gallon of jet fuel, amongst all of the other things, you actually get 1.25 gallons of water vapor. So there's 100 billion gallons of jet fuel that are combusted on a yearly basis by aviation. That spews 125 billion gallons of water into the atmosphere. You've basically got an enormous cloud-generating machine, flying through the air, seeding the water that it's creating from the jet fuel with toxic compounds like naphthalene and all kinds of, metals that are in the petroleum and, all that sort of thing. And the false flag that's being perpetrated is, don't talk about that pollution. Somebody is spraying you. Well, even if there is some type of spraying going on, the multiple orders of magnitude that the problem associated with the pollution has, I would look at it. Now, I don't believe in the conspiracy theory aspect of it, but who benefits from distracting your attention away from the pollution that the aviation industry is spewing all over you, other than the aviation industry? They could use a process called hydrotreating. There's actually a refinery that I found in Denmark that does that. They process the petrol or the jet fuel a little bit more. They take out the sulfur, they take out the naphthalene and some of the other polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons to reduce the pollution. Might cost, a couple of % more on the fuel cost, but it would eliminate the pollution. Well, there's no regulation that says that they have to do that. So they're not going to spend the money, they're not going to do it. Now, that wouldn't solve the problem, it would dramatically reduce the problem. But when people are saying, no, the contrail lie, right? They say, the biggest lie ever perpetrated against humanity is that those are, not contrails, they're chemtrails. Well, they are trails of chemicals, but they're not being sprayed out of some, port in the airplane. They're massive engines using gargantuan amounts of toxic jet fuel, combusting it, spewing it out. It's normally invisible, but when it's really cold and wet in whatever area they may be flying through, you notice it. Now, That's only a tiny little piece of the puzzle. So let's keep going down the list.
Just quickly, though, the chemtrail argument also annoys me sometimes, because if you go to the airport and you go on the bus that's taking you to the aeroplane, you can look underneath the plane. You can look at the engines and you won't see any device on any Emirates flight.
I completely agree. We could have a whole discussion of how people believe claims that are made. And, you know, I forget which Nazi it was, if it was Goering or Hitler, or they're all attributed to it. You know, if you just keep telling the same lie over and over and over and over again, you know, people will believe it. Now, I want to be crystal clear, okay? I am not saying that nefarious things might be going on. What I'm saying is, by pointing to this nebulous, you know, they are spraying us, it's taking the attention away from the obvious problem. That's really, the acronym is interesting. It's ATRAP, air traffic related air pollution. What I'm trying to do, and thank you for, you know, giving me the opportunity, is to raise people's awareness of the enormous amount of pollution that aviation is causing. Now, this is just one aspect of it, okay? Jet traffic is the big one, but smaller aircraft, you know, Cessnas and other planes like that, they don't use jet fuel. They use what's called aviation gasoline, or aviation gas, or avgas, which is still leaded gasoline. While there's 100 billion gallons of jet fuel that are combusted every year, there's about 200 million gallons of leaded gasoline used by smaller airplanes. Now, there's been studies where they find that the lead that comes out of those airplanes is a really good ice nucleating particle. If you've ever worked with lead, you realize it sucks the heat right out of you. So if you wanted to create ice crystals, you know, lead in the exhaust of airplanes is a very good way of doing it. But unless you've got some other stat there that you want to talk about, let me go back to the thing that I said was my big Eureka moment a dozen years ago. In 2010, a movie came out called What in the World Are They Spraying? And I believe it was 2012, Michael J. Murphy came out with Why in the World Are They Spraying? And I admit, I fell for it, okay? I went down the rabbit hole and I started looking, and I did what I normally do. And I put together a 2-hour movie. I put together a website that to this day, I think it was the best website I ever put together. I wrote a 40, 50-page booklet. And then I ran into some information that made me stop and go, hey, wait a minute, some of this stuff doesn't add up. Some of the water tests that people were doing, some of the soil tests that people were doing seemed wrong to me. I'll just put it that way, okay? And so one thing I want to get people to think about is, if you're catching rainwater, you can't attribute it to a trail of chemicals that you saw behind an airplane, because, you know, cars and trucks and industry and everything else under the sun, you know, is raining down. You can say that the rainwater is polluted, and that's a valid something to do, but it didn't match, and there was a lot of anomalies. So I kept digging, and here's the thing that caused me to have an absolute Eureka aha moment. If you've ever watched the space shuttle take off, now I know it doesn't go out anymore, but it used to. Please understand that very soon, you know, after we're recording this, NASA may be launching its new Artemis rocket, which is just
They've been promising since January.
Well, you know, it's hard, you know, to do that, okay? So their space launch system is like a supercharged version of what they used to launch the shuttle, okay? A dozen or so years ago, when I was looking into all of this chemtrail stuff, oh, you know, they're spraying strontium, aluminum, and barium on everybody out of planes, right? When I learned that the 15 to 17 story tall solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle used aluminum fuel. They use a solid fuel aluminum propellant. There's a polymer that holds all the aluminum together. You know, once they light that, can't turn it off, off it goes. If you calculate the mass of aluminum that is in one of those launches, it's along the same, around the same amount as if you took every player on every team in the National Football League, in American football, weighed all of the players. It's about 500,000 pounds of aluminum with one rocket launch, okay? And I realize that, and I go, anybody who is pointing to some little tiny nozzle on the side of a plane saying, oh, they're spraying aluminum at you, and is not talking about rockets and missiles that use aluminum as solid rocket propellant, I'll just be very, very kind and say, you know, they're kind of missing the forest for the trees. And, you know, why are our forests more combustible? Could it possibly be that thousands upon thousands of rockets and missiles that go up into the stratosphere using aluminum fuel that's just slowly settling down on the entire planet? Could that be where the aluminum is coming from? So when I had that aha moment, I threw away my website, I threw away my movie, I threw away my booklet, and I'm like, no, what people are saying is happening are empty claims. They're pointing to what they have concocted in their mind is happening. They have no evidence. When you actually look at Occam's razor and you go, well, what's the most likely source of aluminum? It's all of these rockets and all of these missiles, but it gets even worse than that, because if you think about the thousands of satellites, actually tens of thousands of satellites that have been launched, think about when they go through their working life and they're no longer able to maintain orbit, and they come into the mesosphere and they burn up as they're, you know, people I'm sure have seen things like that. Those metals don't just magically I mean, they disappear, you can't see them, but they don't go away. And so I actually have been shocked myself with the research that I've been doing, the amount of aluminum and metals that are in the atmosphere due to the re-entry of old space junk is on a par with the thousands of rocket launches that have put the aluminum fuel in the stratosphere and above. And so the real problem is actually something that's referred to as brightening. The white particulate matter that is in the stratosphere from airplanes that fly above the tropopause in the stratosphere, from rockets and from space junk that's burning up upon re-entry, is creating this white haze reflecting the sunlight, all these microscopic particles. When you look down at the horizon, you see sort of the white haze. It might be a little blue up above, but then as you look down, you see it getting whiter and whiter. Now, I haven't come up with a term that I'm comfortable with yet. Some people call this accidental geoengineering. Some people call it unintentional geoengineering. You know, whatever the word might be, covert geoengineering. We're making a mess of the sky, and it is doing the things that people are talking about doing to, you know, deal with global warming. They want to spray sulfur or aluminum or titanium or calcium or diamond dust or whatever they want to spray in the sky to mask the sun to cool the planet. Well, you know, decades ago, I believe it was 2010, as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity in the Nagoya Protocol, every nation except the United States and the Vatican and I think Sudan agreed to ban geoengineering. Okay, not the US, not the Vatican, not a couple other countries, but there is a global agreement that we won't do any geoengineering on purpose. But they're essentially accomplishing that to a certain degree by spewing absolute, not tons, megatons of pollution in the sky that is blocking the sun. But unfortunately, there's a very good argument that all of those compounds, while they are, you know, diffusing sunlight and making it sort of a hazy white, all of that pollution is actually acting like a blanket and is trapping heat and is actually part of the problem. So the idea, you know, that they have of, oh, we're going to block the sun, well, let me try to give you an analogy. I hope it helps. Say you were outside on a very, very hot, clear, sunny day, and you wanted to find some shade. So rather than get an umbrella, you had a nice 4 foot by 4 foot sheet of aluminum, and you held it up above your head, and it was shading you. Okay? Oh, great, you know, the sun isn't beating down on me anymore, but the aluminum would get hot as hell, and pretty soon it would be burning your hands. You couldn't hold it up anymore. Okay? So, well, what if you had 2 layers of aluminum? Well, then you could hold the layer above you to get shade, and the heat would be caught by the layer of aluminum above you. You're not making the world cooler. You're just shading yourself. And the aluminum that's above your head is trapping more and more and more heat in the upper levels of the atmosphere. If you measured the temperature below you, you'd be like, oh, great, you know, global cooling, right? No, that's just surface cooling. All of this shit that's in the sky is diffusing sunlight, so maybe we're not getting our proper vitamin D, and that's causing problems. The stuff that's in the stratosphere, quite arguably, as all of that aluminum rains down, it triggers reactions with chlorine. Hydrochloric acid is one of the waste products of all of the rocket fuel, which is destroying the ozone. So we're in a situation now where Elon Musk, I saw an article just the other day, I think they put up their 10,000th satellite. Okay. Well, there is zero regulation on the pollution that Elon Musk is spewing into the stratosphere and above with all of his rocket launches. And with these 10,000 satellites, when they come back down and burn up in the atmosphere, all of those metals, you know, not just aluminum, but imagine all of the, you know, unique metallic compounds that are in all of that equipment, that's going to be dispersed all around the mesosphere and the stratosphere. And it takes years for all of those particles to just slowly settle down. And as they're settling down through the stratosphere, they're going to be messing up the ozone layer. Now, y'all can believe what you want to believe, okay? I'm trying to raise people's awareness of things that I've learned that made me go, oh, wait a minute, nobody's talking about that, and nobody's talking about that, and nobody's talking about that. I'm not saying that our government is anything other than evil. I'm not saying that they haven't done nefarious, horrible things, you know, thinking that it's fine for them to experiment on the population. By all means, if you have any evidence of that, bring it to light. But this elephant in the sky is gigantic. I mean, we're talking numbers that are associated with, pollution, with aviation, not just jets, but helicopters and airplanes and missiles. I mean, think about the number of missiles in the Ukraine and Russian war. Think about the number of missiles right now in the Middle East, okay? Yes, obviously the damage that the explosions are doing are horrible, and, that's obviously a much more important problem. But, what goes up must come down, and as those missiles are launched, they go up into the stratosphere, they spew aluminum all over the place. Point to that for the source of the aluminum, not some mysterious, nefarious plan, where airplanes are spraying stuff on you, because that's just not what's happening. I refuse to use the term geoengineering. I may have said it a few times, and I'm sorry if I did. I wish I could take it back. You can't get away from it. We need to regain control of the language, because with the word geoengineering, number one, I took geology in college. I mean, rocks and earth. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, okay? If what people start talking about is we're polluting the sky, okay, then you get away from the trigger words of, geoengineering, chemtrail, contrail. I think it is absolutely an unarguable position. Every plane, every helicopter, every jet aircraft, every rocket, every missile, even if it was some craft that was going across the sky, purposefully spraying something down upon humanity. Even, a spray plane has to have an engine to give it thrust to go flying through the air, okay? Every one of those crafts are spewing garbage in the sky. I'm just saying, let's have a conversation about that. If you think there's something else going on, go research it, go find the evidence, that's fine. The numbers associated with air traffic related air pollution and the completely 100% absolutely unregulated pollution coming from NASA and SpaceX, and think about it, Russia and China and India and Japan and Korea and, all of the other nations on the planet who are sending up various rockets, all of the military rockets. If you're seeking some conspiracy of somebody is trying to kill you by spraying something out of an airplane, by all means, go look into it. Sure, there's a bunch of weather modification that is spewing garbage into the sky. Undeniable, no doubt about it. But the several orders of magnitude greater problem is being ignored because people are saying, no. It's not jet exhaust. Don't pay any attention to that. And nobody's saying anything about Elon and NASA and all of that sort of stuff. And look at what's going on in the Ukraine and Israel. If you're familiar with Occam's razor, the simplest answer is usually, it's pollution, people, and we need to focus on it.
Yeah, you make a good point. The language actually is a problem. The words themselves become trigger words. Okay, there we go. There's another one. Virus. You will know from the last 6 years that the moment you say virus, there will be a contingency that will go, whoa. And then you can't go any further.
Let me jump all over that. I know we only got a few minutes. I got a call from a good friend of mine last night. And he's like, Jim, I got a question. You're talking about this, you're talking about that. And it's like, 5 or 6 years ago, he was focused on, what I call the PCR fraud, okay? And if anybody understands what the PCR, I won't call it a test, how the PCR fraud was perpetrated upon us, he said, is it possible that people were suffering respiratory problems because of all of this pollution in the sky? And when they went to the doctor or the hospital and they got this cockamamie PCR process done to them, it's not a test, it's a fraud, that they were tricked into believing that they had COVID, but they were actually just dealing with respiratory problems because they're breathing a bunch of crap. I'm like, bingo. Now, you can't, identify, oh, that plane went across the sky, therefore I'm coughing, right? If you see it above you, you're not going to be breathing that. It's going to blow hundreds of miles, downwind as it's slowly settling. So it's, likely that, I live in California, so if I see a plane overhead, it might land in the UK. And if you see something overhead, wherever you may be, in Europe or wherever, that may be landing in China. And, what's going on in China probably is landing in California. The bigger point is what's up in the stratosphere. Any airplane, and very specifically the private jets, the wealthy people flying high, many of those jets fly in the stratosphere. And so just a little tiny bit of meteorology. I'm no expert, but there's some fundamentals that I think I can share. You only get weather in the troposphere. The height of the troposphere varies depending upon where you are, but above a certain elevation, if you're in the stratosphere, you cannot create trails in the sky that are visible because there's just not enough water vapor up there, and the temperature and the humidity are not right. So any flight in the stratosphere, you're not going to see anything. You only see the ones that are lower in regions that are colder and more moist. And so approximately 40% of all aviation is in the stratosphere. They are invisibly doing stratospheric aerosol injection, which it's not intentional because their main purpose is to get, some rich person from point A to point B, right? But the unintended consequence, the side benefit, if you will, is they're polluting the crap out of the stratosphere. People are saying, oh, we have to stop geoengineering. Well, the terminology is messed up. Aviation, rockets, and military, and everything are polluting the stratosphere with aerosols that are most likely actually creating a warming effect. And if they want to point to, oh, global warming, it sure as shit isn't carbon dioxide. It's all the particulate matter and the water vapor and the sulfur and everything else, coming from rockets and the aluminum and all the metals. That is having the same effect as the most gargantuan geoengineering project you can imagine. So I know we're running out of time. Let me just hit it with this summary. What I did a couple of months ago when I published Project in Humanity is I played a little trick on ChatGPT and Google Gemini. And I took all of the numbers that I could compile for all of the pollution from all of these sources. And I said, hey, ChatGPT, hey, Google. I didn't say it was pollution. I said, if I was some insane geoengineer and I wanted to have an impact on the atmosphere of the planet, and I sprayed all of these lists of things that are coming out of airplanes and jet engines and rockets and missiles, what would be the impact? And I tell you, I was half asleep, I didn't even have my first cup of coffee. I woke up with that question in my mind. I played that trick on ChatGPT, and the report just kept coming and coming and coming and coming and coming. That's what you'll find on Project in Humanity. We are the freaking guinea pigs of the biggest geoengineering project you could ever imagine some crazed mad scientist wanting to do. From the pollution that we've been spewing out of every plane, every helicopter, every jet, every rocket, every missile, whether you see it or not, if the atmospheric conditions are such that you can see it, have a clue. That's Mother Nature letting you know that that craft is polluting the skies that you're breathing. It's not...
I just did that right now.
Pardon?
I just typed that in right now, and I asked pretty much the same question, and here's the answer. Yes, continuously spraying these substances around the world would very likely cause serious harm to human health and the environment.
Right.
And it goes on.
People can believe what they want to believe. I gave my phone number. I'll give it again, 310-619-3055. Let's have a reasonable conversation about a massive problem. I'm not saying that there might not also be some, nefarious, evil plot, that somebody's spraying something, they're doing testing or whatever. But talking about it as if it's, they are spraying us versus... Oh, here we go.
Sorry.
Go for it. Go for it.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm just reading what it's saying here. So it says, given the scale, septillions of particles and millions of pounds of pollutants, widespread and severe health consequences would be expected globally, particularly for vulnerable populations such as children, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions. That dovetails with what you said about COVID.
And so when you realize that an ungodly number of ultra-fine, particles, okay? The government measures for particles that are 2,500 nanograms in size, but the ultrafine particles are only 100 nanogram in size and smaller. You can't see it. It's invisible. I'm breathing it right now. You can't get away from it. It's everywhere, okay? When the sunlight hits it in the sky and reflects off of it, you see it as a white haze. If Mother Nature attaches some water vapor to it and it forms an ice crystal, you really notice it, okay? But then it dissipates and it spreads out all over the place, and it slowly is settling down to Earth. If you live near an airport, God help you, it's really bad. So all I'm really trying to say is I would like people to consider what I think is the obvious reality. Every plane, every helicopter, every jet aircraft, every rocket, and every missile is leaving behind it a trail of chemicals. Let's have a conversation about that and do something about that. It's not going to be easy.
What is the solution, though, James?
Well,
to have fewer flights and fewer rockets.
The solution starts with understanding that the airline industry could get lead out of fuel that is used for small aircraft. That's obviously a no-brainer. They could have refineries process jet fuel, just a couple more steps, take out the sulfur and take out the naphthalene. Do you really want, naphthalene from mothballs in your jet fuel spewing out? That's what makes a lot, not all, but a lot of the particulate matter that is essentially, do you want to seed your clouds with mothballs? I mean, I'm not making this crap up. That's literally what we're dealing with here. Talk about toxic clouds. Do you want to seed clouds all around the world with the residue from 100 billion gallons of jet fuel, 200 million gallons of leaded aviation gas, and enormous amounts of water vapor, along with all of the metals and sulfur and nitrogen and everything else that's in the fuel, and have raining down on that aluminum from NASA's Artemis rocket? When, if they get their act together and they actually launch Artemis 2, whenever they get around to it, as you watch it go up, realize that the plume coming out of the solid rocket boosters on the side is aluminum. And it's going up into the stratosphere and beyond. And that doesn't just magically disappear. It's going to circle the globe and gradually over the next couple of years settle down. But then there'll be another one and another one. And if you actually dig into how much, how many rockets around the world are launched, it's unbelievable. It's absolutely unbelievable. Volcanoes cause problems. They are on a much, several orders of magnitude greater than what we're dealing with. But it's a different level of toxicity, and it's in a different region of the sky. We're doing it especially over Europe, over Asia, over the United States, the concentrated effort in that thin strip of the atmosphere over populated areas, okay? Sure, volcanoes have happened forever, it's a problem, but it's, for the most part, kind of sort of a steady state. The volcanoes are always happening. That's background, and that's an enormous amount of particulate matter. But we're adding to that a not insignificant amount. But let me address your question in a different way, because that's one of the things that, comes to people's minds. Sure, if you look at pollution compared to the Earth and the universe, yeah, it's relatively small. What I'm saying is, think of the largest geoengineering, stratospheric aerosol injection, climate engineering project that you could imagine. It's not happening, okay? It's theoretical. But even if it was, it would pale compared to Project Inhumanity, which is my name for what we're doing to ourselves with all of the airplanes and rockets and everything that is spewing measurable amounts. I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of gallons of jet fuel, hundreds of millions of gallons of aviation gas, and megatons of aluminum rocket fuel and other fuels with all of the many rockets that NASA and SpaceX are launching, and every other nation around the world. Whatever you might be worried about pales compared to what's actually happening. And when you look up in the sky and you see white trails behind airplanes, that's only about 5% of the miles being flown. 95% of the time, airplanes fly through regions of the atmosphere that don't trigger that ice formation. And so if you think what's going on in the sky with the white trails behind planes is bad, that's only 5% of that small part of the problem. You still have all the aviation, leaded, gasoline. You still have all of the rockets and all of the missiles and all of the aluminum and from that. The problem is actually much bigger than you could imagine. And it's not due to somebody spraying something to try to kill you. It's due to the aviation and rocketry industry spewing its garbage all across the atmosphere, quite frankly, with impunity, because various people are going, no, don't look at that. Look at, the problem is some mysterious, evil cabal.
Look over there.
That's the definition of a false flag. Doesn't mean that it's not happening. A false flag means you're blaming the wrong culprit. So the aviation industry is getting off scot-free. NASA and Elon and anybody else doing rocketry, Bezos and all them, they're getting off scot-free. Nobody's going, hey, wait a minute. What did you just spew over my head? I'm just trying to get people to realize that the problem that they're worried about is not the problem. The problem that they should be paying attention to, and they shouldn't worry about it, they shouldn't be afraid, they should get upset that they've been bamboozled into thinking, oh, it's something other than what it really is. And, I got the receipts, and anybody who wants to have a conversation about it, give me a phone call, 310-619-3055.
Yeah, I mean, you've made a highly persuasive argument.
I'll speak of myself, okay? I have a belief structure. I do a lot of research. I try to learn what's going on. And in the course of this, I've asked a lot of questions. Go do some research. I don't believe anything that Grok or ChatGPT or whatever. But, if you ask questions and you get answers, sometimes the answers are surprising. And you look at it, you have to look inwardly and ask yourself, well, I thought the answer was fill in the blank. But as I'm doing my research, I'm finding that oh, there's a different answer that conflicts with what I thought it was. Now, are you open to that new information? Or do you defend your position to the death because you identify with the beliefs that you have accepted? That's the problem with, quite frankly, religion. It's like, well, I'm not going to go there in this conversation, but the idea is, if somebody comes in and says, I have some new information, right? If you want to have some fun with it, this is kind of rude, but you can do it. Excuse me, are you open-minded? Would you like some new information? Or do you already know everything you need to know? I've had a lot of people say to me, think about COVID. I don't want to know. I don't want no more information. I'm happy where I am. I want to believe what I believe. Don't bother me with your new information. Okay, fine. Have a nice day. You can't make people take the red pill. Yeah. Okay? If you've ever seen the movie They Live, right? Put on the sunglasses and see the truth. Take the sunglasses off. You go, oh, propaganda, truth. Propaganda, truth. I have, for quite some time now, on the bottom of every one of my articles, had a little picture of the little boy in the, childhood story who's pointing at the emperor who's not wearing any clothes, right? That's kind of what I do. It's like, hey, do you believe certain things? The emperor's naked. There's no there. What I have witnessed in this chemtrail, geoengineering, climate engineering space is people make outrageous claims, and then they repeat them, and they repeat them, and they repeat them. People adopt them, repeat the claims that were made, and my first thing is, well, can I see the source material? Can I see the evidence? Could I bring that into a court of law? Do you got documents? You got, truth? Or do you just have a story? And the story is usually mixed up with fear-mongering. Oh, we're all going to die. They're trying to kill us. Don't look at the problem that's something that is real and you can't deny, and it's going to be hard to fix. Let's just blame somebody. Let's point fingers, make claims, and say, they are trying to kill you, when if you actually really take an honest, good, hard look at the problem, you go, oh, there's no evidence for that, but there's a ton of evidence for all of this pollution. So the summary of all of it is, the problem is pollution. If you're talking about chemtrails or condensation or contrails, condensating on what, right? What is it condensing on? Yes, it's water vapor, but it's not just water vapor. So the government position of, oh, don't worry, it's just water vapor. Well, yeah, there's a lot of water vapor there wrapped around a whole bunch of toxic crap, okay? So it's propaganda coming from either direction. And, with geoengineering around the world, quite frankly, has been agreed to be outlawed by the Nagoya protocols, except for the United States. We're not a party to that, so, we can still do it. All I ask is for people to have a little bit of a aha moment where you go, I honestly, I never really thought about the space shuttle and the NASA rockets are aluminum. Could it be that that's where the aluminum is coming from? Along with Sahara dust and all that sort of thing. Have an inquisitive nature, ask some questions, challenge all of my work. If you point out that I'm missing something, you'll be my best buddy, right?
How can my audience follow your work?
I do a lot of different things, but for this, just go to projectinhumanity.com.